Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Tuesday, November 26th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start just trying to make sense of the CFP race right about now. We'll go through every conference, including the Group of Five, and we'll try to break down where everything sits as we go into that final week. Then we'll get into the winners and the losers from this past weekend. Definitely the SEC haters had a very, very nice weekend with a lot of teams falling. The officiating in the sport had a very bad weekend and has had a very bad year overall. And then we'll get into some upset alerts as we head into this weekend. Definitely some upset alerts all around the country with the rivalry games all around. That Georgia Tech game over there in Athens is going to be a very interesting one to watch. Then we'll get into a Week 14 whip around. We'll get into a little bit of update for the Group of Five teams as we head into that final week. See what the championship races are looking like. And then we'll get to some of the under the radar games from the weekend. A couple of games that could have been a little bit bigger, but some people didn't hold up their end of the bargain. Some that I felt like were going to be absolute classics. A couple that are trying to be set up as rivalries going forward over there in the SEC. And then we'll finish it off. We'll do a little bit of a top 15 Tuesday for you guys. A lot of movement in the top 15, as you can imagine. So tried to break it down as best I can. We'll see what everyone thinks of that. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show. And the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have fun back and forth here, is to use the super chat. At the bottom of the chat on the Sports Network page, you can click that $sign, add any question, comment you'd like. It'll pop up on the screen and we can have fun back and forth here. Definitely want this to be as interactive as possible, so utilize that. Also, GSMCPodcast.net is up and running, does the exact same thing, so if you'd like to utilize that, you can as well. But let's go ahead and jump into this thing, because there has been a lot of stuff that has happened over the last about 72 hours, and we have to figure out all of the craziness around the CFP race now. So a lot of stuff has gone on, and we'll go conference by conference, try to break down who can get into the title game from each conference, and try to break down where everyone stands in terms of the playoff. And I think the most confusing one, the one that everyone's kind of surrounding and trying to figure out, is the SEC. That's the one where everything kind of went crazy this past weekend, obviously. So the SEC title is as simple as can be. It is Georgia against the winner of Texas A&M. Whoever wins that game in College Station this weekend, we will pick that tomorrow, so be on the lookout for that. But whoever wins that game will face Georgia in Atlanta at the end of the year. For A&M, I do believe that they have to win the SEC championship if they want to get in. I think a loss in the SEC title, even if you get a win over Texas, would probably knock you out with 4 losses. So they would be in a tough spot if they don't win out and win the SEC. So that gives you a very interesting situation where right now it feels like those top 4 teams are the ones that are very much in contention for this thing. So you have Texas, you have Georgia, you have Tennessee, you have Texas A&M. Texas A&M, I think, has to win the SEC. For Georgia, I think if you win this weekend, you are likely in, regardless of the result in the SEC title. I think they could lose, be 10-3, and still be a team that's probably traveling somewhere for a game, maybe even hosting a game, depending on the way that the CFP committee looks at that. For Tennessee, I think you're in as well. As long as you get a win this weekend against Vanderbilt, I think you're absolutely in this field. You're probably going to be a team that is traveling, if I had to imagine. And then you do have Texas. I think for Texas, I think they're probably in. I think they're a team that, with all the carnage that happened this past weekend, I think they're in a pretty good shape. Now, if they do lose to A&M, I think they're in, but I probably think they're traveling somewhere. If they get to the SEC title and lose, I think they're probably hosting a game. If they win it, they're obviously getting the bye. So there is a huge benefit to winning the game this Saturday, at least getting to the SEC title, because at the very worst then, you'd probably be hosting a game. But if I had to imagine, a 10-2 Texas, even with a loss this weekend, would probably slide into the mix just because of all the craziness that did happen. Probably wouldn't have been the case if everything went relatively chalk, or even if, Bama and Ole Miss, if both those won, then I think Texas would be in a tougher spot. But as of right now, it feels like they are relatively safe for the CFP field. And then you do have Bama and South Carolina. Those are the two that everyone's kind of watching on the outside. I think Bama's going to need another upset, maybe like Notre Dame falling, or one of the ACC teams not playing that well, all that different stuff. And then for South Carolina, you do have to win out, you do have to beat Clemson, and then probably need to get a little bit of help from someone else. So outside of that, I think they are out. I don't think they're going to get in just by sheer, moving around of teams, but we'll see what happens in the rankings tonight. Maybe Alabama or South Carolina is a little higher than I'm expecting, but as I look at it right now, I do believe that it's going to be those teams on the outside looking in, win. If Notre Dame were to fall, if Tennessee were to fall, if one of these teams were to go down, then the door would open up, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, which team I would probably open the door up for first. But definitely a very interesting situation over in the SEC, and they have officially taken down the odds for Georgia and Texas to make the CFP, so they feel pretty confident that those two are going to win this weekend, or even if Texas doesn't win this weekend, that those two will be in the field at some point. Tennessee, they feel pretty confident with as well, which kind of backs up my statement of they really just have to win this weekend, and they're probably in. For A&M, they're all the way at the bottom because they probably have to win the SEC. They probably have to find their way to beating Texas and then turning around and beating Georgia and Atlanta. That's a very tall order. So then you do have Alabama, Ole Miss, and South Carolina right there. They're probably in that chaos scenario. Alabama, a little bit less chaos than the other two if I had to imagine, but definitely a situation where you pretty much have Georgia and Texas in the field as long as Georgia doesn't slip up this weekend. You probably have those two, and then Tennessee you feel pretty confident in as long as they can take care of business this weekend. Over to the Big Ten, they are as easy as can be, and I really appreciate them for that with all the craziness that is going on. But Ohio State is likely in, even with the loss this weekend, I would have to imagine. A 10-2 Ohio State with wins over Indiana and Penn State, probably getting in if they win, and I expect them to be totally honest. But if they do win, I think them and Oregon are likely playing for the 1 or the 5 seed, which is the two best spots in the CFP. So those two teams have been the best two teams all year. They will probably be playing for that 1 and 5 seed at the end of the day, as long as Oregon takes care of business against Washington, as long as Ohio State doesn't trip up against Michigan. That will be for the 1 and the 5 seed over there in Indianapolis. Then for Penn State, you just got to win this weekend. I think you're in a really good position to even host a game if you win this weekend, because 11-1, you're in a really good spot right now. I think there's a chance they drop a little bit below Notre Dame tonight, but we'll see what happens there. Regardless, I think you would slide into that 6-7 spot, most likely, maybe even the 8 spot, depending on what they do with the SEC loser, but definitely going to be really interesting to watch all that unfold. But at the end of the day, if they want to get to Indianapolis, they're going to need a loss from Ohio State, but overall, they are firmly in as long as they win this weekend. Then you do have Indiana. They're in as well with a win. I feel very confident in that. Frankly, if they're not, then we're going to have a couple of problems on their hands. And they do play Purdue, which is pretty comfortable. Frankly, there's a world where they wouldn't drop out with a loss, but they're playing Purdue, so they definitely would drop out with a loss. So they can only get to Indy if Ohio State and Penn State both lose. They're likely traveling for a CFP game if they win this weekend. I would have to imagine they slot into the 9-12 range and have to travel at some point, probably in that 10 spot if I had to imagine for Indiana. And then for Oregon, you're in, no doubt about that. Now, you probably do want to win this weekend to not jeopardize that number 1 seed or number 5 seed for that Big Ten championship, but as of right now, you're in a really good spot, and at worst, I think you're hosting a playoff game. And that kind of shows itself here. They feel very confident that those 3 teams up top are going to make it, and then Indiana, you could bet against them if you want, but they're probably not losing to Purdue. So all those teams are likely in the field. I feel pretty confident that as long as there's not any craziness this next weekend, and even if there is a little bit, I think those 4 teams are fairly comfortably in, and we'll see what happens with that Indiana team. We'll see where they slot in, but all those teams should be in. I believe 2 will be hosting, 1 will be traveling, and 1 will obviously get that bye week. And then you do have the Big 12. This is a very interesting conference with a lot of moving parts right about now, but we'll break it down in pretty simple terms. I do think it's still a one-bid league. I think it's very unlikely that multiple teams get in. I think it's almost impossible, frankly, for multiple teams to get in. So we're really talking about the title scenarios here, and the biggest one is Arizona State, BYU, Iowa State, and Colorado are all tied up there at the top. If Arizona State and Iowa State win this weekend, they are the ones that go. If all these teams win, Iowa State and Arizona State will meet in Arlington. If Arizona State were to lose, then BYU would find their way in. Or if Iowa State were to lose, BYU would be the next team up. If 2 teams in that group were to lose, then Colorado would be up. And then there is a world where all of them lose, all of the teams right behind them win, and you have about a 9 team logjam at 6-3 at the end of the year, which would be a nightmare. Let's just be totally honest. It would be an absolute nightmare to deal with, but there is still a world where a West Virginia gets into this thing, or a Kansas State and Baylor is not all that far-fetched to find their way into this thing. So it's going to be really interesting to watch all this unfold. Obviously, Iowa State has probably the toughest game of the bunch, playing Kansas State, so we'll see what happens there. If Iowa State were to lose and then the rest of the big dogs were to win, it would be Arizona State and BYU, a little bit of a rematch of what we just saw in Tempe. So a lot of different things that could happen if all of those teams lose. If you have Arizona State lose, you have Iowa State lose, you have Colorado lose, you have Arizona State lose, excuse me. You could have a Baylor Kansas State. I believe that would be the next thing up. So a lot of different things that could happen. And then in the 8-way tie scenario where you could really get to in this, it could be the Texas Tech West Virginia game that decides whether it's Texas Tech going or whether it's Kansas State going to play Baylor. So a lot of stuff can happen. Let's just be totally honest. I don't expect us to need all of the crazy scenarios. I do believe at least 2 of those top 4 teams are going to find a way to win this weekend. But there's a world where all of that goes crazy, where only one of them gets a way to win, or all of them lose, and then you have to figure it all out. At the end of the day, I do think Arizona State is at least going to beat Arizona. I tend to believe BYU is going to beat Houston, so I tend to believe it's probably going to be either Iowa State, Arizona State, or BYU, Arizona State, depending on that Iowa State-Kansas State game. So a lot of moving parts. I understand it's absolute craziness, but it'll all make sense at the end of the week, I promise. But for the championship odds, you do have Arizona State is the top team. Forgot to reorder them there, but Iowa State is number 2, BYU right behind them, and then Colorado, and then quite the gap. So gives you an idea. All those teams right after them definitely need a little bit of help. Kansas State obviously has the best chance to give themselves help, but will be interesting to watch all this unfold. I tend to believe we won't need the crazy scenarios, but we've needed the crazy scenarios plenty of times in the Big 12, so we'll see what happens there. For the ACC, this has been relatively unchanged, and I think the biggest thing here is an at-large bid is very much open for this conference now, and frankly, I think they're firmly in that at-large bid spot right now, because you have SMU. You are on your way to the ACC championship. I would make sure that you win this game this weekend. If you were to lose this game this weekend, go into the ACC championship with 2 losses, and then lose, I think you would be on the outside looking in. So you have to be very careful. You want to make sure you win this game, and then I think you can afford a loss in the ACC title game to Miami or to Clemson and still find your way in at 11-2 in this scenario. So I think SMU, as long as they win this weekend, I feel pretty good that they're in the field. Miami, kind of in a similar boat. I do think if they win this weekend, they're pretty firmly in the field. I think if they were to lose this weekend, there is a world where they could get in as an at-large bid. You probably would need a little bit of help from some other people around you, like, say, Notre Dame were to lose or Penn State were to fall or something like that. I do think that would open a door for maybe 3 ACC teams to get in. But the way that I look at it right now is it's probably the ACC champion and the runner-up there. For Clemson, they have a little bit more of an opening. You know, they have Miami. If they were to lose, they're obviously in the ACC title, playing SMU, trying to get a bye. They could lose that game, or they could not get to that game. And travel for a first-round bye, which would be or for a first-round game, would be very interesting to watch. And then I do think there is an at-large bid path with them beating South Carolina, would obviously give them a little bit of feather in the cap, and then maybe USC beats Notre Dame. I think it could get to 3 teams. So as I see it right now, I think the ACC is pretty much the way that I put it is as long as SMU wins, as long as Miami wins this weekend, those 2 teams are pretty firmly in, at least in my mind. And then I think you do have a Clemson or even a Miami on the flip side of that could be lurking around trying to possibly get in. We'll see what happens. Probably would need a little bit of help, but I do think the ACC really benefited and probably will get 2 teams into this thing. So you do have 2 teams that are minus. So you do have Miami and SMU. They are minus odds to get in. They feel pretty confident that it is going to be 2 ACC teams. And then you do have Clemson right there. It's going to be really interesting to see all of that unfold. Those are not championship odds, apologies. Those are CFP odds. So definitely going to be interesting to watch all of this unfold. And if Miami were to lose this weekend, Clemson were to win, then a lot of crazy stuff were to happen. But at the end of the day, it does feel like the ACC is going to get 2 teams in there. Feel pretty confident that it's going to be Miami and SMU, but Syracuse will do plenty to try to mess up the Miami season, that's for sure. And then you do have the group of 5, and UNLV has kind of entered the chat a little bit in the group of 5, which sounds crazy, but it's relatively unchanged. UNLV is in the mix now, but the way that I see it is probably Boise State, if they win out, is the number 1 team. Then I think Tulane, if they win out, would be number 2. Then I think Army might get the nod over UNLV with only 1 loss, and that 1 loss being to Notre Dame. I think that would be a battle back and forth. I would lean that Army would get the nod, but as you see by the odds, not feeling all that great about it. And I think that's more they don't feel great about them beating Tulane, but it's one of those situations where I do think if Army wins out, they probably get the nod over UNLV, but that would definitely be a battle. So UNLV, if you were to win out, there's still a world where you find your way into this CFP. As crazy as that sounds, if you knock off Boise State at the end of the year and maybe Tulane loses this weekend to Memphis and then beats Army. That would set up perfectly for someone like UNLV to find their way in. So a lot of stuff can happen in the G5, and as you can imagine, we'll try to break it down as best we can. It's been a crazy, crazy time, but the way that I see it right now in sheer numbers is there's going to be 4 from the Big Ten. There's probably going to be at least 3 from the SEC, maybe a 4th, but probably only 3. Then you do have 2 from the ACC. I think you have Notre Dame, Group of 5, Big 12. That's the way that I see it right now. And as for the teams, I think Texas, Oregon, and Ohio State are pretty firmly in. Almost regardless of what happens this weekend, I feel pretty good that they're somewhere in that field. That could vary, obviously, depending on the results, but feel pretty good that they will be in the field. Then UGA, Penn State, Tennessee, Notre Dame, Indiana. Barring disaster this weekend, I think they are all in as well. So I think we'll know about 2/3 of the field after this week. It'll be interesting to see where all those teams slot, but definitely a lot of teams. I think Texas probably benefited the most from this past weekend because they just had to beat Kentucky and everyone else imploded, and they're pretty much sitting pretty going into that final weekend. Now, they want to beat A&M, no doubt about that, but it'll be interesting to watch all of this unfold. We will keep you updated with all of the craziness next week as we get into it, but feels pretty good right about now. I feel like I have a good grasp of everything, and then a craziness I'm sure will follow. But we'll get into that as it does. We'll take our first break here, and when we come back, we got winners and losers from Week 13. Big winners were the SEC haters out there, the Indiana fans that were battling SEC people all week. You guys won the week, no doubt about that. So I'll break it down right after this, so stick with us.